Good morning, everyone. I hope you guys had a wonderful snow day yesterday and are staying warm today. It is very chilly out. I did want to kick us off with a few announcements. One, don't forget that Friday there will be no instruction, so it means Friday is a day off. There is no remote work, so feel free to use that time to complete any work that you need to, catch up on work, and make sure that you are set moving into next week. Another announcement, we will be hosting WIDA testing this Friday, so if you are coming to that, once again, please be safe, drive safe, and we will see you then. Wonderful. So this week, we had started looking at a president, and one president in particular, named Andrew Jackson, and under Jackson, we'll start looking at the policies and ways in which America expands into the western regions and into the Louisiana Purchase. So one thing I did want to start us off with was this image that you see on your screen right now. This is a very famous image and is known to represent the moving of westward. And so we see here, right, what is supposed to be meant more like the East Coast. This is supposed to be the shipyards, the cities, the towers. Look at the bridge. This is bright and light and modern and quote-unquote civilized. And to the west, a lot of Americans at this time considered it quote-unquote uncivilized. And so we see this transition of trains heading westward, farmers and miners heading westward. But we also see who's being pushed out of the frame with this westward movement of white settlers. Who is being pushed out? And that answer is Native Americans and indigenous groups, as well as bison and more natural habitats and creatures. So we will continue to look at this process, and we'll eventually have a name for who this person is supposed to represent. So we'll get a little bit into that today. So our learning target for today is we're going to obviously have this PowerPoint, but also you'll be reading some primary sources from the 1800s about westward expansion, so that we can better understand how and why the U.S. expanded. This is important to understand why, because as policies are put into place, if you don't understand why, they seem kind of weird or mean or cruel. And so we want to make sure that we have a firm understanding of how Americans and settlers thought in the 1800s. So defining the West. Keeping in mind, right, that the Old West was kind of this area, the Midwest, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin. So this was considered West in the 1700s. In the 1800s, we have the New West, and that's going to be on the other side of the Mississippi. It is also important to keep in mind that during this time period, settlers do kind of hang on to the myth of discovery. As we know, no one really discovered the Americas. They were Native Americans living and having huge thriving cities all across the continent. However, that is not how we were taught, and particularly not how the settlers were taught. So when we start moving west, we keep that idea of, oh, we are discovering the West. Even though an extremely diverse set of cultures already lived there, owned the land, had languages and cities, treaties, but nevertheless, we will have this myth of discovery. So the first couple trails that'll pop up as people move west are going to be the Santa Fe Trail, which started in Independence, Missouri, right on the edge here, and headed right into the territory of Texas and Mexico. So this was a very popular trade route between Mexico and the U.S. It had been used quite often in the past, and will be used again when we inevitably invade Mexico and try and take land from them. This slowly then becomes a route also for people to move across the land. Not necessarily for trade, but to actually move into these areas and live there. Even though this area was claimed by Mexico at the time. We'll come back to that. The second and probably the more famous Oregon trail is the Oregon Trail. You guys may have played this computer game in the past. It's a lot of fun. And tomorrow I'll also post a video and you can tally up if you would have also survived the Oregon Trail. But the Oregon Trail started in, once again, Independence, Missouri, and then it made it all the way to modern-day Oregon. This trail became very crowded very quickly, which also became a problem because, as you can see, in some areas the trailer tracks start to make divots in the dirt, and were hard to, if it got crowded, you couldn't pass people. It was very hard. Along the way, though, which was nice, they had trading stations, so if you had to stop in, get more food, supplies, you could do so. And this eventually led to U.S. controlling the Oregon Territory. We previously claimed it, but so did Russia and Britain. And as U.S. people moved into Oregon, we eventually gained full control of the area. A lot of other things were moving around at the time. In the east, they were building canals and rivers to try and make sure that, we could ship goods inland into the western regions. Most famous of these are probably the Erie Canal, which started in the Hudson River and went all the way to Buffalo, New York. And this connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, which meant that they could ship goods from Europe and stop in directly into Chicago and not have to cross land. How'd they do this? With a locking system. So they would kind of raise and lower the water so boats could move through. Pretty soon after canals were made, we start to see the expansion of the railroad. So different waves of construction start to happen from the 1830s through the 1860s. Railroads are popping up all across the East Coast and heading into the Western Territory. By the 1869, there's actually a railroad across the entire United States, east to west. We'll come back to how and why that was important. Government support definitely led to the success of these railroads. Henry Clay in particular pushed very hard for the railroads. I want you to take a moment and think, why would the government want railroads into the Western territories? There's a lot of reasons. But think of what might the government gain to have quick access into the Western territories. Hopefully, things that are coming to mind could be easy to trade with, maybe to make money, but really importantly, it was so that the government could control the territories, because before that, we didn't have control. It was groups of people moving out west and no one to really govern them. Okay, so feel free to go through the discussion questions. Okay, what if we take one thing away from today, hopefully it is the understanding of manifest destiny. This is also what you'll be reading about today in your assignment. Manifest destiny is a term that was actually just coined in 1845, but it set the tone for how Americans view the West for decades. So manifest destiny refers to the idea that God had made it the destiny, or God said that it was inevitable, right, that the U.S. would reach the Pacific Ocean. It was their job. The U.S. had to reach the Pacific Ocean. Why? Because God said so. God had told them so. It was only obvious that we would spread the ideals of America to the West Coast. This made it so they could justify moving west and taking land from other countries, tribes, and people. Because as soon as they were like, hey, I think what we're doing to the Native Americans are wrong, other Americans could simply say, well, God told us to. This is what God wanted. And so it becomes an excuse a little bit for how we treat and move into the West at this time. Moving westward does inevitably mean that we run into indigenous groups to the western areas, and we will eventually move them out of their land so white settlers can take it. Next week we're going to go a lot more into this, but here's a quick intro. So as white settlers moved west, pressure definitely increased on Native Americans and Native American territories. Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, signs the Indian Removal Act against the Supreme Court and forces the removal of Native Americans in these areas into the Oklahoma Territory. This was a forced relocation that ended with a lot of suffering and death in some cases. So we're going to look more into this, kind of see how, today we're looking at how westward movement impacted the settlers, but next week we're going to be looking at how westward movement impacted indigenous groups in the West. So life on the frontier. So let's say you had made it all the way into the Western Territories. What would your life be like? Well, everyone would have to work, even the kids, because life was hard. You had to build your own home, and most often had to build most of your own supplies because there was no one to trade with, and if it didn't fit into your wagon, it didn't come with you. Your houses were built of sod, which is mud and grass, and so when it rained, your houses melt. The terrain was difficult for farming. Eventually, the steel plow was invented and helped, but overall, it was still a very difficult way of living. Mostly you grew corn, wheat, and cows. Same today. If you drive through the plainlands, you will see mostly growing corn, wheat, and livestock, such as cows. If you got sick or had an injury, there were no hospitals, so you just kind of hoped that maybe your wife knew how to sew and could sew you back up. So immigrants on the frontier, it's not only Americans who are settling the West. There's actually a lot of people coming from Europe to move directly into the western areas. And so if you travel through the plain states, every now and then you'll find a village or a town that is predominantly German or Slavic. And for example, one time, I can't remember the name of the city, driving through Iowa, we found at the time, a Czechoslovakian village, which was interesting, but they had been there from this time period. Women also moved on the frontier. They came with their husbands and children, and they played a central role in the new homes. They had to keep up all of the traditional roles, like cooking and cleaning, but also working on the farm. And if they didn't, things just didn't really work out. And in part because of that, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado become some of the first states to grant women the right to vote. So not only was it because women were working hard, but it was also because if there were more people voting, that meant that these states had more representation in the U.S. government. Perfect. Okay, so that is what we have for today. There are discussion questions at the end, but we're not going to run over them because we're running out of time. But I did want to introduce our worksheet for today. Let me make this nice and small. So our worksheet for today, we have, let's see, this guy. I'm trying to make it fit a little bit better. Then you'll be reading, there we go, a map. And the first, looking at a map from the time period, describe and look at kind of what was happening and how does this relate to manifest destiny. And then we'll be reading directly from John O'Sullivan's writings. He is the one who coins the term manifest destiny, and he sparks a huge movement of settlers to move west. And then you'll have questions at the end. If you have any questions on this or concerns, feel free to email me, message me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day and stay warm.